That somebody else thinks like me feeling. Bruce Charlton. The somebody else thinks like me feeling is probably, mostly, a feature of psychological adolescence, by which I mean that transitional mental phase between childhood and adulthood. It is a feeling I associate with reading particular books, more than anything else. Although I did sometimes get the same feeling, albeit very rarely, when meeting a new person. A particularly memorable and clear example was Colin Wilson's The Outsider, which I encountered age 19, at a point when my mind had for several months been increasingly occupied by exactly the matters that were the focus of that book, especially the problem of the triviality, dullness, and alienation of mundane everyday life. How there are experiences in which this alienation may apparently be overcome, but that these moments of fulfillment are always, it seems, brief and temporary, and incomplete. Wilson's book was a thorough and multifaceted explanation and analysis of the problem, such that I realized it's not just me who experienced modern life in this way. My initial hope was, naturally enough, that Wilson's writings might be, or might point to, the answer, but of course that was not the case. I say of course because I now believe that there is no full and permanent answer to this problem in this mortal earthly life, because this life is a transitional and learning phase of an eternal soul, so this life is itself a kind of adolescence. Therefore a full answer that is the resolution of the problem is only possible by moving on to spiritual maturity, which lies beyond death. Nonetheless, it was a considerable encouragement to realize that I was one of many people who knew and grappled with this problem, and who regarded it as a very significant problem. Since there was nobody in my real life who talked about such matters, or who seemed to take them with the seriousness that I did, The Outsider book, and those that followed along the same line, both by Wilson and recommended by him, meant a great deal to me. Frodo's big mistake in first using the One Ring, and its evil consequences. Bruce Charlton. Despite possessing it for many years, Frodo Baggins seems never to have put on the One Ring, until he was staying in the house of Tom Bombadil. Bombadil had asked to look at the ring, and had done a conjuring trick to make the ring disappear for a few moments, before returning it to Frodo, who is uncertain that what has been returned to him is the real ring. Something prompted him to make sure. He was perhaps a trifle annoyed with Tom for seeming to make so light of what even Gandalf thought so perilously important. He waited for an opportunity, when the talk was going again, and Tom was telling an absurd story about badgers and their queer ways, then he slipped the ring on. Merry turned towards him to say something and gave a start, and checked an exclamation. Frodo was delighted, in a way. It was his own ring all right, for Merry was staring blankly at his chair, and obviously could not see him. He got up and crept quietly away from the fireside towards the outer door. This is significant, because Frodo is being dishonest with himself about why he wants to put on the ring, and doing this for the very first time. Frodo apparently tells himself the reason that he needs to use the ring is to make sure that it is the real one, which would be a serious reason. But this is immediately contradicted, because Frodo's subsequent behavior is frivolous, and treats the One Ring as if it were merely a party trick. Frodo is therefore pleased at Merry's surprised reaction by Frodo's sudden disappearance, and Frodo starts to creep quietly away, in order, presumably, to continue the joke. In the event, Tom Bombadil can still see Frodo, and calls him back. In terms of what Frodo knows of the identity and nature of the One Ring, this behavior by Frodo is shockingly shallow, and trivializes the perilous importance of ring, despite Frodo's self-deception that he is annoyed at Bombadil failing to take the ring seriously. And, as would be expected by Frodo having knowingly misused the ring, this action very soon has bad consequences. The very next evening, in the Prancing Pony Inn, the ring is able to slip itself onto Frodo's finger while his attention is diverted, make him disappear in public view, and thereby the One Ring reveals itself to servants of Mordor who are watching Frodo, who immediately report this event to the Black Riders. By first using the One Ring frivolously, for trivial reasons, Frodo has made an act of consent that thereby gave the ring enhanced power over him. There is significance in the fact that this happened in the safety of the House of Tom Bombadil, at a time when Frodo felt completely safe, and was off his guard. That Frodo felt safe, makes his use of the ring gratuitous. And just after Bombadil has demonstrated that he was, apparently, the only being in Middle-earth over whom the One Ring has no power at all. Lots of old age, not much growing. Francis Berger. In living things, beings, growth implies change and development, usually in the form of an increase or expansion. Why then do we refer to the process of aging with the seemingly contradictory phrase growing old? We begin to shrink physically past a certain age, say, 50 or so. Instead of growing, expanding, and maturing, we diminish, contract, and over-ripen. Where then is one to find the growth that aging apparently provides? It takes little rumination to understand that growing old should refer to the spiritual, that we should use old age to focus on changing, developing, and expanding our spirit, on reflecting on our mortal lives and our memories, on learning lessons yet unlearned, on tying up loose ends and neglected phrase from our mortal relationships, on preparing and building up ourself, our true self, for resurrected life. Very few elders today appear to understand this, which helps explain the ubiquity of septuagenarians, and older, saturating the system via politics, corporations, finance, the military, NGOs, boards, churches, and organizations of every imaginable kind. A half-rotten cornucopia overflowing with individuals in the grips of glaring physical and mental decline, yet all still doggedly determined to grow, increase, and expand something, that is, everything but the spirit. Some might suggest that this overabundance of the aged in public life and positions of power has everything to do with the accrued wisdom such individuals have to offer. To this I say, when was the last time you heard any system old-timer say anything that was even remotely astute? In fact, when was the last time you heard any general old person say something sagacious or act wisely? I'm not saying such individuals do not exist, but they are becoming increasingly rare, and that reveals something deeply unsettling about what's left of our so-called culture and civilization, to say nothing of our fundamental metaphysical assumptions, or lack thereof. Old men in shorts, versus growth in old age. Bruce Charlton. A phenomenon that has swept my part of the world over the past couple of years is old men out and about on the streets and in shops, wearing shorts, or what Americans call short pants, e.a. short trousers. This used to be very rare, except at the height of summer and on holiday, but nowadays, it's clear that old men have, in droves, set aside their long trousers, and taken to wearing shorts all the time and in all seasons. This weirdly misguided and counterproductive assertion of continuing youthfulness fits with the theme of a thought-provoking post from Francis Berger where he discusses growing old with an emphasis on what kind of growing this ought to entail. Growing old should refer to the spiritual, that we should use old age to focus on changing, developing, and expanding our spirit, on reflecting on our mortal lives and our memories, on learning lessons yet unlearned, on tying up loose ends and neglected phrase from our mortal relationships, on preparing and building up ourself, our true self, for resurrected life. While the sight of superannuated codgers in cut-off trews seems like a trivial inconvenience, merely an eyesore, I have nonetheless come to regard this as symptomatic of a deep and increasing the spiritual resistance to growing old, which is one of the besetting sins of modern Western civilization. The reason is obvious enough, that, without a confident expectation of continued personal existence beyond death, a post-mortal life that is affected by present life, then there really is no benefit but many disadvantages in getting old, and no viable coherent prospect of growing old. The life of the modern middle-aged and elderly person, including, so far as I can tell, nearly all self-identified Christians, is then inevitably some kind of combination of an always losing battle to remain, or seem, youthful, and a progressively increasing terror of physical deterioration, suffering, dying, and then an annihilation. Owen Barfield's concept of participation provides the basis of what is needed for Christians, as of 2025. Bruce Charlton. Owen Barfield's concept of participation provides the basis of what is needed for Christians, as of 2025 and going forward. Barfield assumes that participation in divine creation is both our nature as created beings, and also the proper aim of created beings. Creation is in the direction of developing participation in the direction of freely creating in greater consciousness. More exactly, that this is our proper aim as Christian beings who have chosen to live by love and therefore in harmony with God's creative will. The reason why participation is so centrally and vitally important to Christians, is that it is by participation that there is creation in the first place. Creation is itself, if properly understood, a matter of participation, because creation is, as all Christians acknowledge, primarily a matter of love. For there to be love in this relational and personal Christian sense, there must be distinct beings each with the capacity for loving, and then love needs to be mutually chosen. The cohesion of divine creation should therefore be understood as an ongoing process of harmonizing the motivations of beings, harmonization through the love between beings. In different words, divine creation is, partly, a matter of once indifferent beings, coming to participate in the creative direction of God's loving nature, through loving God and loving one another. It is this love between beings that is the basis of the harmony that is creation. But divine creation is also living, dynamic, continuing, increasing. And by the Christian understanding it is God's intention that men become fully, and divine, sons of God, share in the work of creation, and who each contribute something unique, because from themselves, new, and additional to creation. Therefore, the direction of creation is towards greater consciousness and choice among beings, towards an increasingly active participation, which change must be freely chosen by each being. That is to say, there is a change through time from a mostly passive, mostly unconscious, harmony of creation in which individuals largely serve the divine will and each does not bring much new and additional to the whole, and towards what must necessarily be a more collegial participation in the work of creation, by which every single being that chooses to live by love, is consciously enabled to contribute that which is unique in himself and which he learns to the totality of creation. A mischance at glory requires a sorry. Francis Berger. Adam Piggott recently wrote a thought-provoking post in which he comments on a book that contrasts the responses of pagans and Christians to past pandemics and plagues. Unsurprisingly, the Christian response to such events in the past was far more admirable than that of their pagan counterparts. In the same post, Adam includes the following observations about contemporary Christians and our general reaction to the 2020 birdemic. Bold added.
But aren't Christians today just a very sad, sorry, selfish and fearful bunch when compared to Christians of the past? While those Christians did all they could to help the suffering, while contracting the disease themselves and then dying the death of a martyr, today's Christians cower behind their closed doors in fear, eagerly submit to taking a poison vaccine made from aborted babies, and insult and shame their fellow Christians who might object to all of their fearful behavior. Well, as far as COVID is concerned, the world blew it. I said it at the time but I will say it again now, what a lost opportunity for the church to show courage, leadership and faith to the world. Imagine if the Catholic Church had stood united alone in showing the world what real faith meant. It could have been the most glorious moment in the history of the church. But not to worry. God is always ready to give us another shot at glory.
I agree with Adam. The Church, and virtually all organized Christian institutions, did indeed miss a massive opportunity to show courage, leadership, and faith to the world in 2020, and I am sure that God, as our loving Father and Creator, will actively strive to provide Christian churches with other shots at glory. Having said that, I am fairly sure Christian churches will waste those opportunities just as ingloriously as they blew their chance at glory in 2020. Why? Simple. The churches refuse to acknowledge, let alone admit, that they did anything wrong in 2020. As far as they are concerned, their decision to close down and willingly declare themselves to be an inessential service was all on the up and up. Peachy, creamy all the way through. No regrets. Nothing to repent. Even more astonishing, instead of repentance after they reopened, they advanced plans like this guy who wrote a guilt-tripping diatribe about how it was a Catholic's sacred duty to attend Mass and receive the Eucharist, which is, wait for it, essential. Failure to attend Mass and receive the Eucharist, the source and summit of Christian life, according to the clown, is, wait for it again, a sin. Closing the churches and denying the faithful the Eucharist. Immaculately virtuous. Saintly even. Look, the churches failed the contemporary pandemic test epically, nevertheless, however epic that failure was, it pales in comparison to the even more epic failure to acknowledge and repent that hideous sin, despite the churches being slaves to the system. As I noted in an earlier post, passing the COVID test would require the churches to openly admit that they are slaves to the state and had no choice in the matter. They could have then repented their involvement in that demonic disaster, frankly, openly, and explicitly. Most did the exact opposite by actively, willingly, and enthusiastically supporting, promulgating, endorsing, and enforcing the state's coercion, tyranny, and lies. I can't think of any major church that has acknowledged any wrongdoing, let alone taken any sort of step toward repentance. There may be some out there, but I haven't heard of them. Christians can be slaves and remain Christian, but it requires A, acknowledging that one is indeed a slave to worldly forces, and B, repenting actions one is forced to do against one's will. Will God provide the churches with more shots at glory in the future? Yes, I think so. Will the churches use those opportunities? No, absolutely not. Glory is difficult to attain. Sorry, not so much. And glory is virtually impossible to achieve without sorry. In fact, there is a special kind of glory in sorry. Unfortunately, contemporary Christian churches seem utterly uninterested in either. Without a sorry, more missed opportunities at glory are guaranteed. Reading mainstream Christian theology nowadays, I am amazed I converted. Bruce Charlton. I have just been reading an exposition of mainstream Christian theology, the theology common to Western and Eastern Catholics and the major Protestant denominations, and I am struck by how it nowadays strikes me as utterly unsatisfactory, being over-inclusive, and consequently incoherent, and evasive. It would really have repelled me from becoming a Christian, had I realized that I was signing up to commit to believe in such stuff. From my current understanding, the deep problem seems to be at least twofold. One is recurrently trying to fit Christianity into oneness philosophy, which leads to a recurrent compulsion to talk of unity as our aspiration and ultimate goal, and thereby to dissolve away individuality, freedom, evil, and indeed time. The other is trying to make Christianity into this worldly religion, suitable for incorporation in a church, a method for improving human behavior, and to serve as the basis for a nation. Part of this was making Christianity into an historical religion, provided with an arc either of spiritual decline or spiritual progress. and A, this worldly endpoint, including a second coming of Jesus. By trying to provide for too much, Christian theology ends up making itself into a species of abstract nonsense. Whereas Jesus' teaching, as seen in the fourth gospel, is actually very simple and clear, but it is next worldly. The reality of Jesus' religion was neither about making better people nor a better world, either immediately or in the long term, so the fact that this evidently did not happen, and shows no sign of happening, is not a refutation. Jesus offered individual people the chance to follow him to resurrected eternal life in heaven. It is by resurrection, by being born again, that better people are made, and it is post-mortal heaven that is the better world, the world which Jesus actually promised. So really, the Christianity of Jesus Christ was next worldly, and its societal effects on this world are derivative from the individual consequences of personal confidence in Jesus' promises about the next world. But, unsurprisingly, most people want palliation and happiness now. They demand that their religion promises a better mortal life, an improved society and civilization. They want justice on earth far more than the promise of heaven. And, apparently, from soon after Jesus ascended, the theologians and philosophers have made valiant attempts to construct a Christianity that provides what various people, at various times, have demanded of this worldly religion. By passing itself off as this worldly when it actually is not, and by trying to satisfy people's demands for a better mortal life and a more congenial social situation, official Christianity became bloated, distorted, and nonsensical. Which is a terrible shame indeed, because all this is a significant obstacle to the intellectually honest. I was only able to become a Christian by persuading myself that I was not thereby committed to believing everything that people officially told me, any more than in my life as a scientist and academic I was bound to believe everything written in textbooks, or indeed everything said or written by even the best in the field. Eventually, I did find the truth in Christianity, and only in Christianity, but the real truth is of a different kind than this worldly promises which I, like most people, were seeking and hoping for. Not that there is anything wrong with wanting to live a better life in a better world, but we need to be clear that at best this can only be a temporary and local palliation of the fundamental human condition. The lesson of Jesus Christ is that we really can have what our hearts most desire, but only on the other side of death, and only in heaven but not on earth. Seeking an external, socio-political, cure for modern alienation. Bruce Charlton. Like many people, I began to feel alienated, cut off, trapped inside my head, from other people and from nature, at the onset of adolescence. And I sought some, at least theoretical, way of relieving this chronic state of dysphoria. Something better situation, that I could look forward to. Up to the age of about 19, I pinned my hopes on socio-political change. It was Karl Marx who seemed to have popularized this idea of alienation as a socio-political phenomenon, due, ultimately, to class economic disempowerment. And the idea that alienation both could and should be cured by wholesale communist revolutionary societal change. As an adolescent, I implicitly agreed with this basic analysis. I saw the problem in the world, not myself. However, I was never a revolutionary communist. Nonetheless, I saw the answer in socialism, either in a gradualistic Fabian socialism, that would free everyone by abolishing poverty and providing universally decent and stimulating conditions. Or, more deeply, in a socialism of the William Morris type, a medievalism that fitted with my yearnings for Middle Earth, and what seemed like the paradisal societies there depicted. In sum, I looked outside myself and to society at large for the answer to my personal alienation. My implicit idea was that if society in general could be set right, then I personally would feel engaged with the world in the ways that I most hoped for. My impression is that this external and socio-political solution is where most people stand on the issue of alienation, most of the time, insofar as they are at all aware of it in themselves. This is, indeed, a deep reason why so many people are so engaged by politics, why for so many politics provides their bottom line motivation, why ideology has replaced religion in the West. People are not just seeking different social arrangements, but more profoundly there is a hope that such arrangements will alleviate their post-adolescent estrangement and assuage their yearnings to participate in reality. I mean that most people never get further than seeking a cure for their inner malaise in some hope for societal reform or revolution. But aged 19 I changed my perspective, and changed it to one that saw the answer in terms of my own consciousness, my attitude to the world, how I understood reality, framed it, my aspirations and attitudes. This perspective I adopted is one that seems to have been initiated partly by the failure of politics, and then by reading several key books, including Michael Tippett's Moving into Aquarius, which led on to C.G. Jung, Colin Wilson's The Outsider, and the early few chapters, written or much influenced by Wilson, of William Arkell's A Geography of Consciousness. Over the following years this led on to all sorts of other books of a very broadly New Age kind, but it is important to note that I remained an atheist, as I had been since age 6, or at most perhaps an abstract kind of pantheist. In particular, I did not believe this reality was created, and especially not by a personal God. So, in practice, my perspective throughout young adult life was, at its bottom line, psychological. In other words, the desired change of consciousness was something that needed to come from physical/material changes in the minds and brains of myself and, plus/minus, other human beings. In sum, and in terms of an answer to alienation, aged about 19, I moved from seeking a bottom-line societal, to seeking a bottom-line psychological answer to this problem. And the answer was necessarily understood in terms of improving my own happiness primarily, the happiness of others I cared about secondarily, within the span of this mortal life, because mortal life was all that really is. After a few years of approaching and circling the matter, it was only at the age of 49 that I fully began to seek the answer to alienation in spiritual and otherworldly terms, made possible after becoming convinced that reality was created by a personal God. In seeking a cure for alienation in the assumption of an individually relevant purpose and meaning in life, I came to see that this made objective sense, that is a sense that rises above the subjective level of wishful thinking or delusion, in a universe created by a personal and loving God. It is within that context I now sought a cure for alienation, and eventually found it in the resurrection promise of Jesus Christ. My current understanding is, ultimately, neither socio-political nor psychological but instead spiritual. I believe that alienation is part of the human condition in this mortal life, which life God intends to be a transitional and learning stage of our eternal existence, a phase en route to heaven. We cannot escape this worldly alienation in this mortal life, except partially and temporarily, because this is the primary creation in which entropy and evil are mixed, and permeate ourselves. In that sense this mortal life on earth is by its nature, and considered alone, as if freestanding, something of a tragedy, that cannot be cured within its own limits. And that is why decades of seeking and striving failed to find an answer. There was no answer to be had. But because I regard mortal life as a temporary phase, I can confidently look forward to a complete answer to my alienation, which answer is that full, active and conscious participation in the divine work, in context of mutual love untainted by death and evil, on the other side of death, in the second creation of Jesus Christ. Is everything a total fake? Bruce Charlton. It is an interesting and significant fact, that major controlling institutions in our totalitarian Western society often tolerate, and indeed fund and publicize, books, TV, movies, and social commentary, the arguments of which categorically assert that everything in public discourse is a fake, and, in the most uncompromising versions, always has been a fake, through history. The expounded idea is that official and mass media narratives are, in general, pure illusion, based on nothing at all, an eggshell of false narrative enclosing a void of real-life content. At the most extreme level, the everything are fake people seem to be saying that nothing ever happened, at least nothing that was said officially to have happened. They are suggesting that public discourse has always been pure illusion. With individual exceptions, this is not generally true, especially not as we go further back into eras in which the mass media and state propaganda systems were smaller and less effective. I feel confident that everything has always been a fake is not true, from the big changes in increasing fakery that I have experienced through my lifespan, and by the obvious acceleration of such trends through the 1990s and into the 21st century. If fakery has got so much worse in living memory, then clearly things were less faked in the past. Also, we know that total fakery isn't the norm from the huge efforts that the system invests to make things happen. This would not be the case if it was normal, and expected to manufacture significant fakes from zilch. Important fakes aren't built on nothing, for the obvious reason that then they would be less effective. We all know that lies mixed with facts are much more convincing than complete fabrications. When fakery incorporates real aspects of actual events, fakes are far more difficult to disentangle and thereby disprove outright, hence far more convincing to the credulous and inattentive majority. What, in general, happened in the past was that underlying events were essentially real, albeit much more often contrived by the authorities than realized at the time, but the truth of reality was exaggerated, or twisted by fakery, in order to manipulate public opinion. The incremental trend, especially over the past several generations, was both for fakery to become more dominant, and for the underlying real events to become more top-down contrived. For instance, the 2020 birdemic was very nearly a total fake, in that it was invented, planned, and implemented top-down, and some evidential aspects were total fakes, for example things that had not happened were theatrically staged and filmed. But as a total phenomenon, the birdemic incorporated many real-world actions and events, and the consequences of pseudo-therapeutic interventions, for example extra deaths caused by supposedly anti-birdemic medico-social changes, into its predetermined narrative. Eventually, there resulted a hyper-complex and deliberately confused mass of many inventions, illusions and lies, built upon and mixed with a few factual realities. Consequently, we know for sure that the official narratives are all false and deliberately misleading, but it can never be known what actually happened minus the fakery. The lesson is that although some small things are indeed a total fake, most important lies will interweave real facts and events. Which does not, of course, mean that there is some truth in, for instance, the birdemic, the CO2 climate narrative, or the current top-down imposition of AI, because events and facts are not truth. We must learn to distinguish between facts and truth. Facts only have meaning when interpreted by theory. Thus, when theory is false and dishonest, then real facts can only serve to sustain a false and dishonest understanding. In sum, all the major strategies of the global totalitarians are fundamentally and intentionally false, despite their not being total fakes, and despite whatever correct facts and real events are woven into them. Total fakery is not the real problem, which is why people are encouraged, officially, to entertain the idea of total fakes at such length, and in such detail. It is intentional untruthfulness in service to evil intent, that is the real problem. Beyond left and right. William Wildblood. If the current struggle between the various factions of humanity proceeds without resolution, we will lose ourselves in destruction. These divisions can only be resolved by meeting on a higher plane. Outer differences, if paramount and left to themselves, lead to endless conflict. Only by transcending these differences can any kind of peace and reconciliation be found, and only those who can transcend the outer differences will be able to move on. Those who cannot will be left behind. This doesn't mean that differences are ignored or negated, but they are seen in the light of something greater. The differences will remain but be seen as subsidiary to deeper truths. It is a glib truism to say that humanity is one. Ultimately, everything can be conceived of, and sometimes even experienced, as one, but the oneness does not override the differences, and not all differences are equal just because of the oneness. Differences are important, and while some are just different, others reflect higher and lower states of understanding and insight, or a greater or lesser proximity to truth. So when we see differences between human beings, we have to take two things into account. Are these differences just on a horizontal plane, different expressions of a similar consciousness, or are they indicative of a wider or narrower exposure to reality, or even a rejection of it? Naturally, most people are attached to their own expressions of difference, but the person on the spiritual path must exercise detachment and discrimination, the one to see himself and his preferred difference objectively, and the other to see exactly what difference is most open to truth. A major difference of the modern world is between what manifests in the political sphere as left and right. The split goes more deeply than this, but that is how it appears most obviously. In fact, this split goes right back to the metaphysical level of truth and love, even if both of these are heavily contaminated by the time they come down to the level of the human mind. But still, the left is motivated by a perception of love, however imperfectly it responds to it, and it is not really concerned with truth, and similarly the right focuses on truth and is far less bothered about love. The question is, which comes first, truth or love? In one sense they arise together because they are both part of the same reality, but this is by no means the whole answer. In fact, truth does come before love in what you might call a non-temporal sense, and the claims of truth do override those of love, even if in God's reality they never conflict. Love must be built on a bedrock of truth. Look at it this way. Truth is represented by the number 1 while love is represented by 2. Truth must always come first. Increasingly these days the left has abandoned truth. Always secondary in their eyes, it now appears to be actively hated. The right has not abandoned love to the same extent, but it is certainly not a priority. Of course, in reality the left only appears to be motivated by love, but that is its excuse. Nor does the right have much contact with truth. These are followed more as ideas than realities, still less lived realities. Nonetheless, they are theoretical motivating forces, and that tells us that if there is ever to be any reconciliation between these opposing forces, it can only come like this. Those on the left will have to give up all their beliefs except love, while those on the right will have to see all their beliefs in the light of love. Both must go beyond their limited point of view and understand just what motivates the other. At the same time, the left must know it exists to complement the right, not for its own sake, and the right must realize it does need complementing. What is playing out now is a battle between truth and love, though really it is between misconceived truth and misconceived love. The only way to resolve this battle is to go beyond form to reality. Then you will see that reality is truth and love, both together, but truth comes first. Those who feel that love must come first fail to see that love can only exist because of truth, and that the primal love is actually love of truth. Love is the wife of truth, and the wife honors and obeys her husband just as he loves and treasures her. This is metaphysical reality. The problem of self-justifying ethical systems. Bruce Charlton. It is a matter of frequent observation that during the era of modernity, i.e. for the past several hundred years, that there has been a continual pressure to change, reform, generally applicable religious moral systems in ways that conform to a need for people to justify their own personal, and specific desires and pleasures. Most often the impulse is sexual. I could not count the number of 20th century political figures, intellectuals, and authors, whose anti-Christian atheism has been, more or less explicitly, motivated by their desire to have systemic justification for their own sexual desires. The same applies to other, non-sexual, preferences. It is quite normal and unremarked for people to argue from their own preferences to the conclusion that everybody and everything be organized around their gratification. But sex and sexuality is the commonest and most obvious example. At first this was a desire for extramarital sex, then for a lot of promiscuous sex, later for same-sex relationship, then for changing sex and all the rest of it. But whatever the personal desire happened to be in an individual, this was linked to a general demand that social/civilizational ethical codes and moral values be altered to endorse it positively. This kind of systemic self-justifying morality is so normal in our era, that it seems, somehow, admirable to the modern mind, as well as supposedly inevitable, that people will advocate and propagandize to encourage society to allow/encourage/subsidize their personal sexual aspirations. This powerful desire for societal, indeed civilizational ethical systems to permit/approve/enforce one's personal sexual, or other, preferences has become the almost unquestioned basis for a good deal of organized radical politics for many decades. And yet, such an attitude is both very unusual in world historical terms. It is also, and would have thought very obviously, an incoherent and unsustainable way of developing social ethical frameworks. In the past it seems to have been normal for those who devised societal ethical systems to construct them on the basis of what they supposed to be the general good, albeit that the general was typically restrictively defined, to almost entirely the ruling class, priestly class, or whoever had greatest influence on societal morality. Individual desires were, at least among the powerful, accommodated by hypocrisy, in other words, those who gratified desires deemed unethical by the general system, nonetheless supported the general system, on the simple basis that the general morality was best for most of the people, i.e. people who mattered, for most of the time and over the longer run. But here and now, it is usual and normative for an individual person, but particularly the intellectual class, to reason that because he personally has a particular sexual desire, therefore society ought to be restructured to accommodate and enforce the fulfillment of that desire. Personal preference is projected into the demand for social norms to be built around it. This goes with a fanatical hatred of hypocrisy, regarded as the worst of ethical transgressions, which increasingly permeates literature and the arts from the late 19th century. Such that it is now regarded as much better for someone to be openly and explicitly cynical, selfish, even evil, and explicitly to advocate a low standard, or even inverted, morality, than to express belief in the rightness of high moral values, but then fail to achieve them. Consequently the anti-hero, a selfish, cynical, but charismatic, villain who does whatever he desires and takes whatever he fancies, is the admired character in modern cultural productions. Whereas anyone who espouses high moral standards, higher standards than he personally can achieve, will be portrayed as boring, coercively authoritarian, coldly cruel, and he invariably gets exposed as a vile hypocrite before the end. Such has been the inversional denouement of most mainstream, popular, and, especially, critically admired TV, movies and novels for several generations. It is a bizarre but stark reality of Western civilization here and now that the primacy of general morality over personal gratification has become so very enfeebled as to be almost ineffectual. And instead the dominant societal ethic has become one in which it is explicitly argued that gratification of individual sexual desires, of one sort or another, ought necessarily and always to be the basis for general, societal, ethical systems. However, does it really need to be pointed out that maximizing a multitude of selfish short-termist sexual desires is, and surely obviously, a reliable recipe for social annihilation? Self-justifying ethical systems are clearly a blueprint for cumulative moral destruction. Yet it is remarkable how seldom that surely destructive consequences of self-justifying ethical systems have been noticed or acknowledged by the most influential commentators of the past few generations. On the other hand, sex is very far from being the only example when obviously and necessarily destructive consequences of their moral projects are invisible to mainstream intellectuals. Which facts tell me that the mass of the most prestigious and powerful intellectuals of the West have been, for a long time, and continuing, actively promoting degenerative social destruction, and are therefore, whether witting or unwitting, allies and servants of the demonic party. This blind or willful mass attitude to the agenda against God, divine creation and the good, is something we ought continually to bear in mind when we consume the outputs of officialdom, mass media, news, science, the arts, education, and everywhere else that intellectuals are employed. Especially whenever we suspect that general moral systems are being pushed on the basis of self-justification. Because I think the problem lies with a rather specific moral weakness of intellectuals as a class, which is a burning desire for ethical self-justification, at almost any cost. I am here pointing out the evil of self-justifying ethical systems. But this destructive fallacy would not have arisen to dominate had it altogether lacked moral appeal, had there not been significant and oppressive evils in the previously existing justifications and implementations of group morality, sufficient that these could seem intolerable. Such that a return from where we now are to pre-modern morality is not just unattainable but undesirable. As so often, both alternatives presented by modern culture for our choice are bad, although the pre-modern is certainly the lesser evil. My inference is therefore that we are each required to discover a third, and genuinely good, alternative, and I observe that society does not offer us any genuine alternative ready-made. Therefore, moral exploration and discernment is something that each must do for himself. The World War II bomber Mafia nearly lost the war for Britain, an early instance of parasitic bureaucratic delusion. Bruce Charlton. The West in 2025 is replete with parasitic bureaucratic delusions, such as the CO2 climate psychosis, anti-racism and xenophilia, feminism, pseudo-healthism and so on, which each weaken, and together will probably destroy, our nations and civilization. An early example of the parasitic bureaucratic delusion phenomenon was the bomber doctrine which led to the bomber mafia, which in World War II dominated the thinking of Winston Churchill and those with strategic control of the UK military. In brief, the bomber doctrine was that long-range bombing could win a major war, by destroying the enemy's capacity to wage war and creating a state of national chaos, after which the army could simply walk in and take over. The Navy was consigned to a very minor role altogether. This hypothesis, it was hardly even that, more of a story, scenario, set of assertions, was warmly received after the years of mass slaughterous infantry stalemate in the First World War, and the bomber doctrine became the basis for the continued existence and expansion of the RAF. Unless you have read some of the things said in the years leading up to World War II and even during that war, you probably could not believe the extent to which it was seriously argued that strategic bombing was, by itself, sufficient to win the war with Germany. Arguing that, for instance, fighter command was not necessary, was indeed a waste of resources that should be directed into building more and bigger bombers. If it had not been for the foresight, ability, character and intransigence of Hugh Dowding, in charge of fighter command leading up to the war, Britain would undoubtedly have lost the Battle of Britain. Bomber Command even regarded the 1944 invasion of France and Western Europe as a needless waste of resources that they could better have used, and strongly opposed D-Day, tried not to cooperate with planning, but were eventually compelled into reluctant cooperation. The appeal of the bomber doctrine in World War II Britain, especially in the early half of the war, was that it clammed and promised, and the word promise is literally true, that strategic bombing would win the war, without need for an invasion of Europe, on its own, and despite Britain's army being outmatched by the German army, if only the bombing could become large enough in scale. Therefore the bomber doctrine had an apparently irresistible appeal to those who were determined that Britain could and should destroy Germany and retake Europe, from its position of besieged isolation. The consequence was that, in practice, everything possible should be sacrificed to the bombing imperative. Whatever the national emergency or military crisis, for believers in the doctrine and their supporters, the answer was always the same: more bombers, more strategic bombing. The bomber mafia fought, with considerable success, to suck resources from all the other branches of the RAF, and from the Army and Navy in general. Indeed, it has been estimated, it is hard to be exact, but this is not implausible, that the total resources consumed by RAF Bomber Command during World War II were greater than the entirety of the rest of the armed forces put together, i.e. greater than the British Army, Royal Navy, RAF Fighter Command, and RAF Coastal Command, combined. And that this was largely responsible for the national debt that delayed UK recovery from the war for so much longer than anywhere else. As it was, Britain very nearly lost the war in early 1943 by severance of the absolutely vital shipborne supplies, e.a. defeat by the U-boats in the Battle of the Atlantic. It seems that the nation came very close to collapse. It was a real emergency, for those not blinded by the doctrine. What is horrifying to me is that this near loss was preventable, and had been caused by the domination and intransigence of the bomber mafia, and the psychological hold the bomber doctrine had on Churchill, and those responsible for the allocation of resources and priorities between the various competing demands of the war effort. With the escalating U-boat threat, air cover was essential to successfully defending naval convoys. This was perfectly possible, but until late in 1943, Coastal Command was starved of resources and aircraft by the insatiable maw of Bomber Command, which took nearly all of the suitable escort and anti-submarine aircraft, and all of the best aircraft. What was needed was a very long-range four-engined aircraft that could provide air cover across the whole Atlantic, and it was well within technological capabilities to provide such machines quickly and in large numbers, and thereby protect the vital convoys. But the bomber mafia fought bitterly and tirelessly to keep all such aircraft for its own allegedly war-winning effort, and were, overall, supported in this by Churchill. Eventually Coastal Command got sufficient very long-range Liberator aircraft to provide full air cover, hunt and destroy the U-boats, and win the Battle of the Atlantic. My point here is that the very nearly war-losing and delusionally false bomber doctrine was never more than a purely hypothetical, untested and unevidenced, dreamed-up narrative. But it was a make-believe tale that was adopted and sustained by a powerful bureaucracy, which sold the idea to those who wanted it to be true, for whatever various reasons of their own. Once the bomber doctrine was established and psychologically accepted, and the bomber mafia had become entrenched and powerful, then logic, evidence, even the imminence of national collapse, could not dent it. The bomber doctrine was a psychosis that fueled a parasite, the bomber mafia, which all but annihilated the nation that hosted it. The bomber doctrine was, then, a literal psychosis, and one that, at least, twice very nearly lost Britain the war, and by bankrupting the nation, lost us the peace that followed, but this made literally zero difference to its proponents. Except to increase their fanatical zeal. The analogy with our present situation is obvious. Nothing short of the actual collapse of the nation and civilization will stop the delusional bureaucratic parasites from their work of destruction. And looking out from the ruins, upon the chaos they helped cause, still they will never admit that they were wrong all along. Bomber Command seemed unable to grasp even that they themselves needed to win the Battle of the Atlantic in order to function. Britain imported all her oil and petrol by ship, without which bombers would, obviously, be unable to fly. Yet such was the delusional nature of their thinking that simple self-interest could not overcome it. Again, this psychotic incoherence is something seen in analogous bureaucratic situations, here and now. The evil propaganda of metaphysical personal insignificance. Bruce Charlton. When looking back across what is known of human history, it is notable that whatever was the official and established religion of the past, and whatever is the atheistic materialism of the present, almost all of them share a fundamental, metaphysical, assumption that individual people are insignificant in the context of total reality. All these systems of religion or ideology seem to be united in an insistence that individual human beings cannot make any difference to the big picture in the long term. Nonetheless, despite that individuals make no difference whatever they think say do, the conclusion is drawn that it is a sin, or dumb, or an insane delusion, but certainly a bad thing, if or when an individual believes that he does or can make a difference to eternal reality. What is recommended of each individual is always to recognize and accept his own ultimate insignificance, and therefore to strive for something like humility, servitude, obedience, self-abnegation. Despite vast differences between religions, and between religion and no religion, and between ideologies, it is striking how they all nearly always converge on this same assertion. Ultimately, you don't matter. You need to accept this as a fact, and live accordingly. So many millennia of anti-individual propaganda, hammering down on us throughout our lives, is indirect evidence that we have contrary innate, spontaneous, and instinctual conviction that we are personally significant, and we do matter as individuals, and that what we think, say and do, can make a difference to the big picture, and permanently. And that this difference may be positive. There is, I suggest, an inbuilt assumption that we, each of us personally, and alone, can potentially make total reality better. I don't think we need persuading of this, because it is a given. But we do need some kind of metaphysical explanation of how this could be true. I.e., an explanation of just how I personally could contribute something unique, irreplaceable, and positive, to eternal reality. We need this especially, given that all the society-wide and available metaphysical explanations of history, seem to be dedicated to explaining how we personally are necessarily insignificant, and therefore cannot make any difference to reality. Or, maybe, explaining that, by believing in our personal significance and trying to contribute positively, we will necessarily be doing wrong, and making matters worse. Therefore, as so often, we need to seek an explanation for ourselves and to our own satisfaction, rather than seeking it ready-made, from external sources, or to the satisfaction of social authorities. An explanation of how it is true that we personally and alone can potentially contribute something positive, unique and eternal to divine creation, is a thing that my partly self-developed metaphysical assumptions and Christian theology intends to accomplish, to my personal satisfaction, at least. Note added, I would also state that I've noticed that some highly individualistic, eccentric, and creative people are among the most ardent advocates of standard off-the-peg incoherent metaphysical monism. I tend to assume that there is a psychological explanation for this, that it is a consequence of guilt. And perhaps also of trying to provide cover for that person's many violations of the metaphysical consequences of his supposedly fundamental beliefs, in a situation when that person cannot adequately explain his own nature and choices in terms of his own assumptions. What is instead needed is for such people really to examine the nature and basis of their metaphysical assumptions, but these are often dogmatically insisted upon by the authorities that he most respects. In the end, something gives, as it must. Residual spontaneous enchantment that can be elicited by religion, and its dwindling. Bruce Charlton. One conceptualization, derived from Barfield and Steiner, that I have found helpful, is that modern man is emerging from a situation in which we had a significant, and powerful residuum of spontaneous enchantment, by which our experience was of participation in the world around us, and when this spontaneous tendency lay dormant until triggered by symbols, rituals, and various spiritual systems. This was the situation of men in classical and medieval times, the times when institutional and formal religions emerged and dominated spiritual life. But since around the advent of modernity, perhaps starting some 5,000 years ago, but becoming dominant something like 2,000 years ago in the Industrial Revolution era, we have been incrementally coming into a situation when the spiritual systems with their symbols, rituals, texts etc. are no longer able to evoke that latent enchantment, hence mass atheism, or only weakly so, hence the feebleness of current religions. See 2020 for confirmation of this feebleness. Because formal religions and spiritual systems really did work in the past, then it is usually assumed that they are the only and proper way of evoking enchantment here and now. And then it turns out that they actually don't release our latent capacity for enchantment, because that latent capacity to become enchanted by symbol and ritual has dwindled, often to the point of disappearance. And here we are. The usual inferences are: 1. Give up on religion because it doesn't work. 2. Hold fast to religion, even though it doesn't work. But my inference is that religion, no matter how effective it really was at eliciting the experience of enchantment, in some places and times, was itself only ever a spiritual system, and religion never was the spirit itself. Our task is to go behind religion and seek the spirit directly, with the expectation that strong, convincing, and motivating enchantment shall reliably arise from such an encounter. And this requires faith that personal seeking of direct spiritual experience is indeed what God wants from each of us, here and now. The desire for spiritual power. Bruce Charlton. Once one has acknowledged the reality and primacy of the spiritual world, comes the question of what to do about it, and since we dwell in this world, then it seems inevitable we shall hope that spiritual power will be used to improve this world in ways that we desire. This motivation is often ascribed particularly to those who practice magic in its various forms, but is equally common among the religious, including Christians. Most of what Christians hope for and work for is focused on improving mortal life in this world, albeit sometimes this improvement is conceptualized in terms of providing a better environment for the encouragement of conversion and spiritual development. Yet, I suppose that most Christians would acknowledge that their primary efforts ought to be devoted towards eternal life beyond this mortal life, to whatever is the form of spiritual preparation for heavenly existence that they personally regard as most necessary and desirable. This, then, seems to be our situation. The way we are made and the way of the world dictates that we cannot help but focus on the material and physical conditions of this mortal life, and from our own perspective. While at the same time Christians know that this ought to be secondary to regarding the spirit as primary and post-mortal life as the priority. In this respect, the situation resembles the rest of life. We know better than we can actually live by, and often by a large margin, and therefore repentance rather than reform is the only sure answer. Nonetheless, most people make matters much worse than they need to be, by their chosen commitments to this worldly engagements, and then they are led into choosing to make this worldly considerations, usually political in nature, not just their consuming interest, but their bottom line morality, that upon which they are most motivated, most intransigent. Unfortunately, the Christian churches encourage exactly this, in that they operate in terms of self-definition, inclusions and exclusion, primarily in terms of various this life, and this worldly stances. As is almost inevitable for any institution in today's totalitarian environment. In conclusion, the most important thing is that we can and do, as individuals and in our personal conviction, stand apart from this worldly concerns, and refuse to be manipulated sufficiently to keep a clear head and heart about what is primary. Get clear on what ought to be most important. And what ought to be our bottom line, no compromise, motivating convictions. This will not be found in the realm of public discourse, which is the domain of Satan. Apparently very few people, very few Christians, are able to accomplish this basic spiritual task at present. As is evident from their passionately expressed concerns about an event mega reported as top news in the mainstream over the past couple of days. This is, in other words, another litmus test, and, as usual, most self-identified Christians who have expressed their opinion, i.e. adopted a pre-allocated role in the totalitarian narrative, have, so far, failed it spectacularly. Recent events. William Wildblood. The events of recent days in America seem to me to be significant. A frontier has been crossed with the sacrifice of a young white girl by a brutal savage caught on camera, and then the murder of someone whose chief fault in the eyes of his enemies was that he was a believing Christian. It is easy to write these off as terrible but not that unusual killings, given more relevance by the fact that the media, mainstream and social, uses them to promote its own ends. There is certainly an element of that, and we must avoid being influenced and manipulated to go in this or that direction by unholy powers with their own agendas. But there is more, because these two events are deeply symbolic of where we are today. First in America, but really all over the West. Beauty and innocence murdered by evil and goodness destroyed by hatred. That is what we are up against, and it may be that fewer people will now be able to look the other way and pretend that all is more or less okay in the world. We are in the middle of a battle between good and evil. It is a spiritual battle, so not all external events will fall neatly into place on one side or the other in the way these seem to do. In a sense, the individuals concerned in these two cases are not important. This goes beyond them to what they can be taken as representative of. Things truly are coming to a head. It is essential to avoid being carried away by an emotional reaction, because the devil knows very well how to take advantage of that and channel the unbalanced feelings brought out, even if justifiably, into his own work. But we need to feel a cold determination in the face of attack to do what we can to further the work of God and continue to maintain the truth in a world that has abandoned it. Added note: there are several articles online claiming that both these events were stage managed and either didn't take place or not in the way presented. Frankly, I doubt it, but similar things have happened before, and there is definitely an interest in stirring up anger and hatred and dividing people further, possibly with the intention of provoking a civil war. I am sure there is no depth to which the powers that be will not sink. But still, whatever the truth of the matter, it is important not to allow oneself to be stampeded into reaction. Observe, be aware, but maintain a level of detachment, which is not to say don't allow yourself to feel, only that there is a balance to be struck. That is the way to go. God has his own agenda. Try to put yourself in harmony with that. It's important to recognize how very bad things actually are, civilizationally. Bruce Charlton. A recurrent source of disagreement I have with nearly everybody, and going back to about 2008, is that I am acutely aware that our civilization is in a really, really bad way, much worse than almost anybody is prepared even to entertain as a possibility. This seems to me very obvious. And also that the problems are as deep as such problems can be, problems of false fundamental assumptions concerning reality, and problems that the strongest human motivations in this life are disordered. The problem of habitual and compulsive dishonesty, including, most damagingly, with oneself, and the problem of being unable or unwilling to learn from repeated experiences. To mention only some of the fundamental problems. I suppose one reason that this conviction of mine is hardly shared, is that people evaluate civilization first in terms of how they personally are feeling, here and now, and if they are feeling okay or happy, they infer that nothing can be seriously wrong. Or that people evaluate civilization in terms of sheer abstract survival and continuity. So that as long as things haven't actually collapsed, or can, at least, be imaged as rebounding or self-correcting, even over multi-generational timescales, then nothing can be seriously wrong. And under this is the truth that matters of civilization aren't our concern, really? Civilizations are not as product of human will and planning, and neither is their continuation. They are a kind of unavoidable backdrop and essential sustenance, and, evidently, a colossal influence in spiritual aspirations, beliefs, perceptions, and yet these matters cannot be positively influenced in an overall or top-down fashion, although they can be negatively affected. In the end, spiritually speaking, we are individual persons and agents, no matter how much we try to elude this, and our primary social concern is with loving relationships, which are the only light that society has to the great dramas of spiritual learning and salvation. Therefore I am not at all saying that we ought to recognize how very bad things actually are because this might help us to make them better. What I am saying here is that, unless we recognize how bad things actually are, then we will not actually pursue the real business of our lives, i.e. the great dramas of spiritual learning and salvation. While some may argue that we don't need to acknowledge the evil nature of the big picture in order ourselves to be good, this seems decisively to be refuted by experience. Unless people feel themselves spiritually detached from our civilization in a profound metaphysical and motivational way, then for so long they will be aligned with the agenda of evil, and at a deep level of affiliation that subverts surface declarations and practices. In other words, observation of what happens when not, brings me to the conviction that we need, to sense, know, acknowledge, take account of, just how very bad things really are civilizationally, if we ourselves are to be able to become clear about this mortal life, and make Christian personal discernments and choices. To be free to choose to follow Jesus, and to learn from our actual lives, entails that we know the nature of our spiritual situation in this world. Anything less just doesn't cut it. Note added, I would like to emphasize that the fullest recognition of how very bad things are, is, or can be, in its effect a great and immediate liberation. By it we are freed from futile engagement with that utterly vast, and impossibly complicated, web of distortions and manipulations that is the realm of public discourse. Positively, we become true agents, with both authority and need to stand on our own evaluations. And thereby we become primarily responsible for understanding our place in this world, and deciding our desired destination beyond it. I, Claudius, the God and four-dimensional chess in politics. Bruce Charlton. I wonder if it was Robert Graves's massively influential two-part pseudo-autobiographical novel I, Claudius, or Claudius as it was written on the cover of the version I read, and which my granny noticed and read out phonetically, leading to a continuing family pronunciation trope, and Claudius the God, that popularized the four-dimensional chess understanding of political leaders, so evident among the self-styled right in the US today. Before Graves's books, it seems that Claudius was regarded as a mediocre and weak emperor, who came in between the two ultra-evil, hence much more interesting, emperors, Caligula and Nero. Of course, Claudius Caesar was also the emperor who successfully conquered England, so for us there is an inclination to assume that there must have been something more positive to him, since he succeeded in beating us where the great Julius had failed, twice. At any rate, Graves decided to depict Claudius as a good, clever, and sympathetic man, whose underlying desire and purpose, unspoken, kept in his secret heart, was to abolish the position of emperor and restore the Roman Republic. Who nonetheless, by a series of accidents, ended up becoming the emperor instead. This assumption I found convincing in I, Claudius, which covers the time before he became emperor, but becomes increasingly untenable as we progress through all the corruptions and evils of Claudius's actual reign, and his final decision to allow himself to be poisoned, and Nero to become his successor. Yet Graves sticks with the idea that Claudius always aimed at good, and manages this by attributing all sorts of 4D chess attributes, including the final desperate masterstroke of ensuring that Claudius himself would be followed by the worst possible successor, in the, as it turned out, mistaken belief that after Nero, the situation of Rome would become so very bad that, surely, the Republic would be restored. This did not convince me at the time I first read See the G, aged 14, and it does not convince me now. Nor am I convinced by attempts to depict current or recent, mainstream political figures, who advocate, promote and do, many or most of the usual mainstream evil things, to depict such characters as being, in their secret hearts, agents for good. Biding their time, taking the long view. Like Saruman, regretting that the ultimate end unfortunately entails implementing malignant means, here and now. But with a master plan to ensure the restoration of common sense and decency in public life, by means of a covert strategy far beyond the comprehension of us ordinary mortals, yet working behind the scenes, always and tirelessly, for our betterment. The Good Thief and Instant Conversion. Bruce Charlton.
And one of the malefactors which were hanged railed on him, saying, If thou be Christ, save thyself and us. But the other answering rebuked him, saying, Dost not thou fear God, seeing thou art in the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man hath done nothing amiss. And he said unto Jesus, Lord, remember me when thou comest into thy kingdom. And Jesus said unto him, Verily I say unto thee, today shalt thou be with me in paradise. Luke 23, 39-43.
I have long been fascinated and inspired by the biblical examples of people becoming an instant Christian. Whether these narrated events actually happened is, for me, secondary to the fact that I understand the gospel writers reported them as things that could have happened, and therefore, presumably, instant Christianity was consistent with early Christian practice. A particularly beautiful story is that of the good or penitent thief, later dubbed Dismas by apocryphal sources. What I get from this is that becoming a Christian was a simple and quick matter, in the beginning. It can, as here, be reduced to two main requirements, encapsulated in the sentences, Lord, remember me when thou comest into thy kingdom, and today shalt thou be with me in paradise. In reverse order I take this to imply 1. That Dismas wanted that which Jesus promised, resurrection into heaven, which I extrapolate from with me in paradise. 2. That Dismas recognized Jesus for what he claimed to be, Lord, and as following him to be the way for men to attain resurrection into heaven. This, I see as consistent with remember me, meaning that salvation is by a personal relationship with Jesus. Of course, I don't claim that these brief and narrative Bible verses entail the truths of salvation. But I find that they resonate with these truths, and that the felt message is one of hope and joy for all men, who are all, and always shall be, ultimately sinners, that is, we are never, ever, fully aligned with God's creative will. The Good Thief demonstrates that this is not a barrier to our attaining paradise, so long as we desire to become fully aligned. And that the transformation of our future state is but the work of a moment. Spirit requires distance from the system. Francis Berger. A big part of system distancing entails building resistance to the system's endless mass communications, marketing, advertising, persuasion, storytelling, and propaganda. The fact that the system's mass communications and mass media are virtually hardwired into modern people's consciousnesses doesn't make matters easy. This is particularly relevant within the development of human consciousness, which is meant to follow a spiritual trajectory, one that should, after a long period of alienation from the spiritual, draw us back toward God and creation. What strikes me about the system's mass communications and media in general is how savvy we moderns proclaim ourselves to be concerning these things. Nearly everyone that I know seems to understand the tactics and ploys the system uses in its communications. People everywhere appear to be aware of communication tricks, persuasion techniques, and media manipulation. Yet when it comes to resisting the media tricks, techniques, and manipulation, the very same knowledgeable and aware people are rendered completely powerless and largely behave like conditioned, salivating Pavlovian dogs. I think the explanation for this sort of conditioning lies in people's fear and rejection of freedom, but it also lies in optimism and hope that the system can be utilized for some kind of societal and social reform. However, any attempt to utilize any part of the system to reform, rejuvenate, or realign the system as a whole is not only futile but counterproductive. Rather than bring reform and rejuvenation, attempts to use the system for good are quickly absorbed, inverted, and used for evil by the system itself. Thus, system distancing involves the understanding that any faith or belief in the system as a principal force for good is not only false, but enslaving.